Welcome to Inside Politics with Kevin Klein, beyond the headlines, beyond the spin. Straight facts, sharp analysis, and common sense conversation you won't hear anywhere else. Let's get started.
Welcome to another edition of Inside Politics. I'm Kevin Klein, joined by two of my colleagues at the Winnipeg Sun. We have columnist Geoff Currier and columnist Royce Koop, who is also a professor of political sciences at the University of Manitoba. We have lots to talk about this week. We have a landmark decision that was made by the BC Supreme Court we'll talk about. We'll talk about how sometimes immigrants get lesser sentences in Canada. And I want to start off by talking about Mark Carney, our favorite topic, really. And we'll take a look at a video.
Has the potential, as I say, to unleash enormous possibilities, to build big things, ports, trade corridors, energy infrastructure, to help develop our natural resources, our critical minerals, help develop our people in ways that connect and transform our economy. Part of, at the core of this act is changing how the federal government operates. One aspect of that is moving from a position when we see a new project from asking the question why to asking the question how. How can we build? And core to that concept of how we build is building in true partnership with Indigenous peoples. And that's why we're here to listen, to hear your perspectives, to make the most of this opportunity.
So here he is, going on and on about how our economy is going to be great, things are going to be fantastic, days after we get hit with a massive tariff by China. And really, he's not talking about that at all.
The Sunny Ways 2.0.
If you ignore it, it doesn't exist. How can he get away with that, Royce?
Well, he won the election. It was interesting after that decision from China came. It's going to have massive implications for Canada, for farmers, for producers. Premier Manitoba and a bunch of other premiers who say, well, something has to be done about this. There has to be aid for farmers. The federal government needs to step in. Well, what the federal government needs to do is to negotiate better deals with these trading partners. This is turning into a disaster. I've said this a million times. Mark Carney was elected on the basis of the idea that he was going to be the right man to negotiate these deals to get us through this tough time with Trump, with other countries, and it is not turning out to be the case. There's no evidence of this, and this decision from China, like it in some ways, it's more consequential than some of what's happening with the United States for us here in Manitoba. It is a disaster, and the kind of lackadaisical attitude you get from Carney, man, it's just getting more and more difficult as each week passes us by to accept.
Yeah, I think Canadians need to wake up, though. I mean, like, we keep going on how the U.S. is treating us poorly. The U.S. is treating us poorly about tariffs. We put 1,000% tariff or something on Chinese electric vehicles because we wanted to protect a plant in Quebec or Ontario, and that company's bankrupt. So, I mean, we're not playing fair. We're the ones doing the wrong actions and sitting there going, "Whoa, they shouldn't be doing that to us." I mean, putting 1,000% tariff on electric vehicles from China when you're demanding that everybody have an electric vehicle by a certain amount of time just seems unrealistic, Geoff.
Yeah, it does. And I think, it seems that for the longest time, Canadians have assumed that we're nice people and the rest of the world is going to like us. And it's a naive worldview that Canadians seem to have because we are generally halfway decent people on a global scale. We're sort of in the upper half of the world in terms of being sort of decent, a decent country. But we're also naive that we think other people like us and that other countries want to be our friends. The Chinese are not our friends. The Americans are not our friends. They're our business partners. They're our trading partners. They are not our friends. And we need to wake up to that and realize that we got to get down and dirty with some of these business deals and as Royce said, negotiate better deals.
Very well said. We are not here to make friends either. Those other countries aren't here to make friends. They're there to make the best deals for their country and their residents that they can. but it doesn't seem like we are. Like we are not even talking about the fact that we put 1,000% tariff on China. We're just saying how bad China is. And of course, the first response from some premiers is, well, the government's going to hand money over to farmers. Well, where are we going to get this money?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the problem, and I think Canadians are waking up to the view that when it comes to these foreign economic relationships, we can't have our cake and eat it too. We can't put tariffs on Chinese electric cars and then expect to sell, all our soybeans and agricultural products to China. We can't. Increasingly, it seems to be the case that we can't have this massive regime of supply management in Quebec and have wide open free trade with the United States that's benefited us for a long time. There's hard choices that have to be made, and my fear, this is going to come up later in our conversation, is that the politicians we have aren't able to make these kinds of hard choices to get good outcomes for all of Canadians, not just sort of narrow parts of Canadian society.
I don't think it's that they can't make them. They're afraid. And they
Sure.
don't know. And they just don't know. I mean, that tariff that we put on China happened a long time ago. It is simply ludicrous that we're still having the conversation about it. But it's more ludicrous saying, well, we'll just hand out more money. That becomes more of a socialist state, makes more people dependent on government. And Jeff, I remember you talking about this before. One of the things governments love to do is make you dependent upon them so you'll keep voting for them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's
Yeah.
government strategy. And the Canadian successive Canadian governments have been extremely successful at doing just that. It's the old, okay, we're going to get, if you elect us, we'll give you all $5. If you elect those other guys, they're going to take your $5 away from you. But if you re-elect us, we'll give you another $5. I mean, it's obviously in very simplistic terms, but that's been the model of, and that's why the Liberal Party of Canada is the natural governing party of Canada, because it's easy to promise people somebody else's money, but sooner or later they're going to come for yours.
I'm going to say something here. It probably will get me in trouble with some people, but like I care. Being in the party and being in the room when we were talking about the upcoming election a few years ago, one of the things the government wanted to do, and they went ahead and did it that I was opposed to, was send everybody a check, Jeff. And I said, well, why would we do that? Why would we, that's just spending money we don't really have. And they said to me exactly what you just said. We got to make these people dependent on us. Once you give them a check, they remember you. They'll vote for you. We were buying votes and we hadn't even started the election yet. So you're absolutely right. And I know that some people in politics will say you shouldn't be talking about that kind of stuff, Klein. But let me tell you something. I was there to work for people. I never thought that I was there to work for the party. And I see this happening, and now I'm hearing it again. I'm hearing it from Wob Canoe. We need money to give to farmers. We need money to give to farmers. It's just beyond me, and I see people complaining about it already online. The other thing that I see complaining about online, I'd like to get your comments on, is the recent decision that the Canadian government had to make on August 6th, where if you want a Nexus card, you have to say either you're male or female. The comments online are so supportive of that. It's unbelievable. The US said if you're going to be on the Nexus card, you have to pick male or female or you don't get one.
I don't have any real strong feelings about how people want to identify with whatever their gender or sexuality is. But essentially, when we're put on this earth, we're given one of two choices, and it's not a choice. We're given one gender or another, and it seems to me that filling out a Nexus card with one or the other should not be a major issue.
It's interesting. It illustrates for a lot of people how deeply integrated this country is with the United States.
Yes.
You get a new president with this particular agenda focus on this issue, and it has real implications for us. And so I feel like a lot of people are kind of noticing that for the first time. This country is very integrated with the US, and we're very subject to what happens in US politics in a way that we haven't been in the past, I think, or at
Well,
least in the recent past.
recent past for sure, but I mean, we also have to respect that that's the law, right? When you want to go into somebody else's country or you want to participate in a program, that's the law. If you were a female and you were to go over to a Muslim country, you would have to cover your head. That's the law. It's not respect. That's the law. It's expected of you. So, I mean, in Canada, asking for that, if you want the Nexus card, again, it's like driving, right? Driving is not a part of your rights. It's a privilege. You know, you get the privilege to drive. And if you want a passport, it's a privilege to use that passport, but that passport has to be recognized by other countries. And you know, the comments online were very much what you guys are saying, right? It's like, well, hey, there's two sexes and we all know that. What's the big deal? Like we should have done this a long time ago. I want to talk about a column that you have, Royce, in the Winnipeg Sun that shocked me, where immigrants in Canada seem to be getting lesser sentences than non-immigrants.
Yeah, I'll give a little bit of background. The act that governs this, the Immigrant and Refugee Protection Act, it has provisions that if people that are in the country are non-citizens, if they commit crimes, if they commit serious crimes, they're subject to deportation. And one of the threshold is that if you commit a crime, if you're convicted and you are imprisoned for 2 years, then you'll be subject to a deportation order and you can't appeal it. If it's less than 2 years, then you get the opportunity to appeal. So way back in 2013, some non-citizen was convicted of drug crimes and he was sentenced to 2 years, and so he was subject to deportation. And he appealed the sentence to the Supreme Court, which took a day off so that he wasn't subject to that 2 year rule. And the court said that lower courts, when they're sentencing non-citizens for crimes, can take into account the immigration implications of the sentence. And so you can reduce the sentence or actually do away with a conviction altogether, if to avoid kind of these big immigration implications. You're going to get deported. And so in the last few years, we've seen this actually happening in the courts. The lower court judges are actually taking the direction of the Supreme Court. And so we've seen examples where they're saying explicitly that people are getting lower sentences, they're not getting convictions explicitly because of the immigration implications of this. And some of these are really terrible crimes, sex crimes, and they covered in the media. So last week, the Conservative Party so that they're going to introduce a private members bill that would basically do away with this. It would instruct judges to not take these kinds of implications into account when they're sentencing. There's lots of reasons to oppose this. I mean, obviously, the vast majority of non-citizens are not criminals in this country, but are appalled by these kinds of crimes.
Right.
And I think a lot of Canadians are really upset. Citizens and non-citizens are upset that these sorts of things are happening and people aren't being deported as a result of this.
But you would think everybody in Parliament, when this bill comes forward, would vote in favor of it because it's ludicrous. Yet again, here is another thing that is just changing Canada. This is not the same Canada I grew up in. This is not the same Canada I was born in. It seems to me that if we're starting to make those kind of judgment calls, that we're losing touch with reality. If you do the crime, if you do the crime, you do the time. It's like we want to send those protests did the truckers protests out? No, and I don't care how you feel about it. I really don't. But the reality is, you've got the Crown going after 7 years for somebody leading a protest, and you're going to get judges that are going to give somebody a break because they're an immigrant to this country for serious crimes, and they are sex crimes.
Yeah, I think the issue for me here is who gets to make the laws of this land? Is it Parliament or is it the Supreme Court?
Yeah.
Our judges are there to interpret the laws, not to make the laws or instruct lawmakers how the laws are going to be written. And it seems increasingly, and we've been hearing about the phrase judicial activism for many, many years now. And this to me seems to be an example of that very thing, of judicial activism. Parliament makes the laws of this land, not the Supreme Court.
That's exactly right. And Geoff, I found a lot of people writing about this issue. They didn't identify that in the way that you did. And I agree. That's the concern, that it's Parliament that passed this law. They came up with this 2 year threshold. And you might think it's too harsh. You might think it's too easy, but it's Parliament that writes those laws. They make the decisions. And the idea that the Supreme Court has said to lower court judges, well, you should tailor your sentences, so that that's taken into account. It's really a concerning example of judicial activism, as you say. And we've seen a lot of that in the last few years, and it really needs a response from Parliament. And so, I'm happy to see this private members bill coming forward for precisely that reason.
So what happens when the private members bill doesn't get accepted, though? The Liberals obviously aren't going to support it, right?
Yeah, well, here's one of the things about private members bills. Even if a private members bill passes in the Commons and passes through the Senate, the government is under no obligation to enact that bill into law.
No.
You do not have to enact it into law, even if it passes, if it's a private members bill.
Oh, come on.
Many years ago, let me give you an example. Former NDP MP Judy Wassilishvili introduces a private members bill to put warnings on alcohol, on the bottles of alcohol for expectant mothers, warning about the dangers of drinking while expectant. The bill passes. It has never been proclaimed into law.
Yeah, the private members bills, it's a question of whether or not this bill will even be considered by Parliament. One of the things we complain a lot about is party discipline. Governments really control the business of Parliament. They're the ones that decide what Parliament does for the most part. There's not as much time for private members bills. There's barely any time for private members bills. It didn't used to be that way. And the parties all whip their members to vote one way or the other. Didn't used to be that way either. And so I would like to see more free votes. I'd like to see more time for private members bills rather than government business dominating Parliament's time.
But let's get back to the Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court judges are appointed by the government.
In Canada, without a vetting process.
Right.
One of the advantages, now, I was going to say one of the advantages the Americans have, but the American process is highly partisan. But in Canada, the Prime Minister appoints Supreme Court justices, and there they will sit.
And now, can the Prime Minister, Royce, change those judges through time, or do they stay do they have a certain length where they're there, or are they there forever and ever? Amen. How does that work?
They're there for a long time. I'm a little embarrassed. My memory is failing me. I don't know if they have to leave when they're 75 or how that works. But oh no, they're there for a long time. And so the prime minister can make changes. Same thing with the Senate. But once they're there for a very long time. And the Liberal Party has been in power for most of Canadian history. It's been Liberal prime ministers that make these appointments, and that's reflected in the kind of decisions that we've gotten in this country for the last 30, 40 years.
So, but I wonder, like, how many Liberal supporters out there actually think that, yes, we should give lesser sentences to immigrants, even when they're serious crimes, because it might impact their immigration. It's ridiculous. Again, I'll go back 7 years for the protesters, and a guy who's threatened to bomb every synagogue in Toronto and kill as many Jews as possible got like 30 days or 60 days house arrest. This is what's wrong. Right? And this is the Supreme Court that's been appointed by the Liberal government. I mean, judges, King's Court judges are appointed by the government, right? They're selected by the government, and that's how Brian Bowman, the former mayor of Winnipeg, got a spot on as a judge and will never have to work another day in his life, right? I mean, there he got that thing, and he was a big Liberal supporter. And then we see what happened in BC, which I wanted to talk about anyways. The BC Supreme Court makes a good decision that could have a ripple effect across Canada when it comes to land and land ownership and, city land, park land, who takes care of that park land. The BC judge or the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Indigenous group, saying, yeah, that land belongs to them in Richmond, part of Vancouver. All that parkland now becomes theirs.
Well, historically, and Royce probably has a better grasp of global history than I do, but land is taken and always has been taken, and land only belongs to somebody insofar as they have the military capability to defend it, and that's what sovereignty is all about, and it always has been. Now we live generally in a fairly peaceful world where borders are respected, but an example is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Vladimir Putin says this land belongs to us, and Ukrainians are saying it belongs to us, but it only belongs to the Ukrainians insofar as they're able to defend that land. And so when it comes to North America, and this is by no means a defense for how the Indigenous population of Canada has been treated by the colonial powers, but I think it becomes a dangerous precedent. Now we know that BC traditionally has been the most Indigenous friendly court decisions that we've seen in Canada when it comes to land settlements, and they've been well ahead of the curve. But we need to be a little bit cautious about this, especially when it comes to other parts of the country. At least in BC, the Indigenous people can at least make the argument, we had physical structures. We actually lived here. This was our land. In most of the rest of Canada, the Indigenous populations were nomadic. They followed the herds. There were no permanent structures at all when the Europeans arrived here. So the notion of land ownership becomes a lot more difficult to make an argument in favor of, I would suggest, because if you're moving around, if you're a nomadic group and you have no permanent structures, no evidence that you actually own the land, I think that's a much more difficult argument to make.
I think the big problem here, though, is what's next? What happens next? So if this actually goes to the Supreme Court of Canada and they uphold that decision, what's next? Who would take the time to invest in Canada under that type of fear? Well, what happens if the decision gets made even greater? There are, some that are saying, like look at here in Manitoba, right? There's an Indigenous group that says the Forks is theirs. They want the Forks back. So what happens? So based on what happened in BC, does the Supreme Court of Manitoba or even a judge of Manitoba say, yeah, you're right, that's your land, and you take that land back? Well, what happens then? What happens to the businesses that are located there? What if they build residences there? What happens to the residents there? This is, to me, this is a landmark decision that has to come down to the government. The government needs to take action on this. The federal government needs to become engaged and take control and lead.
Yeah, so this decision is being appealed by the BC government. There was some
Have they confirmed that?
Yeah. There was some questions whether they were going to. But this is a huge finding. It took years. It's going to take more years to get to or to get a result from the appeal court in BC. It will almost certainly go to the Supreme Court as well. I think the important distinction between British Columbia and the rest of Canada is that most of this country is covered by treaties. And British Columbia is the exception. They didn't, for the most part, British Columbia did not have treaties. And so what we've seen over the last 20 years is there's been land claim negotiations and actually kind of negotiating these issues with First Nations in British Columbia. There's an obligation to do that. We've known it since the 1960s, and it's very, as we're discovering, it's very hard to do this in populated, built-up areas, including this decision affects Lulu Island, the entire city of Richmond in British Columbia. And so I think there's a real argument to be made here that basically for the entirety of the existence of this province, but especially since the 1960s, since the Calder decision, we've known that we have to go through this process. There would have to be negotiations with First Nations in British Columbia, and instead what we got were politicians who were basically, including politicians I personally admire, they were pretty cowardly on this question. They kicked the can down the road. They didn't deal with it in a forthright manner, and now we're having to deal with it in very difficult circumstances. And so this gets back to issues we've talked about before. Politicians need to deal with problems when they arise instead of burying their head in the sand. They're just no good at it.
Well, and to me, this doesn't seem to be a provincial decision, period. All treaties should be that of the national federal government. They should be dealing with the treaties. They should be the ones working with this. I know this was a 5-year trial. It cost millions and millions of dollars. I talked to a lawyer who's familiar with the case who said, and it's all government money. It's all taxpayer money that was used for this trial. Mm-hmm. Like, it was, funding from this group, that group. It was government that was fighting it and stuff. So 5 years, but a treaty should be done by the federal government. not a province. Because if we start saying that they're all provincial, well, that changes everything again.
Yeah, I'm far from an expert on these issues. My understanding, because there isn't a treaty there, it falls to the provincial government to engage in these kinds of negotiations. And the BC government has been very active in this in the last, especially in the last few years under the current premier, David Eby. I think, is it going to scare investors? Yeah, absolutely. And there is going to be uncertainty until the Supreme Court, and it will go to the Supreme Court until the Supreme Court ultimately decides on this. The only thing I would say is that, private ownership of land is not inconsistent with Aboriginal title in the same way that it's not inconsistent with, government regulation. Like we own private property, but we realize we have to pay taxes to the government. We accept that. And it could be a very similar situation with Aboriginal title.
Okay, but hang on a second. What are you saying? That means we have to pay taxes to the government, and then we have to pay taxes to the Indigenous group that has treaty rights? So we're
That's the
paying,
thing. That's the
paying
thing.
it
We
twice.
don't we don't know. We don't know what it'll look like.
Exactly.
And that's
Exactly.
why we should, that's why we have to kind of wait for this outcome now in the Supreme Court. And it will take years, believe me, like 10 years, 15 years, I'll bet, before this is actually resolved.
Geoff, what are your thoughts? Because that is the possibility. That's what people are talking about, is the fear that you'll pay your municipal taxes for your property, but then you have to pay taxes to the Indigenous group because it's their land.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate concern. It's a legitimate fear. I mean, obviously we have to honor some of the treaties that were signed with the Crown. Now we can argue that it was a mistake on the part of Her Majesty Queen Victoria to sign these treaties in the first place, that it created a fractured kind of country, and it was a lot of the treaties may have been a poor idea in some people's view, but they exist, and land claim settlements must be made, and the treaties must be honored, and if they aren't, some kind of settlement must be offered, and it's usually how much. The question is usually how much will it take to make you happy? And to this point, there has been no answer. There is no limit to the how much question,
And how that
and
impacts everybody else.
and how it impacts everybody else. And in the case of BC, of course, uh, we essentially paid to have ourselves sued.
Yeah. 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 We use taxpayer money to sue the taxpayers. And it was funny because one comment was, oh, it's only Crown land. And that's not true. This is parks. This is land owned by the city. This has been identified as city land. That's not Crown land. That's city land. So that who takes care of that park? Who has jurisdiction over that park? Can the police go into that park? Can they arrest anybody there? Because if it's not Richmond land, it's not the city's land. Like there's so many questions about this, but you see the mainstream media, most of the mainstream media is staying away from it because I think, like Royce said, 99.999% of the politicians are afraid to talk about it and they immediately ignore it. And as soon as somebody wants to ask a question, they run for the door because nobody wants to deal with this. But I'm afraid, and I could be wrong, and that's fine if I'm wrong. I'm afraid this is going to become a huge issue. And property ownership in Canada is going to slow down from outside investors. They're going to wait.
Well, it's certainly a big issue, and it will be going into the future. And the problem is that it's uncertainty. We don't ultimately know what it's going to look like. We know it has to happen. We know we've got to do something about this, but we don't know what the final outcome is going to be. And of course, uncertainty is the really bad thing for investors.
But I think it was Australia where the federal government there, they dealt with it. They put out this is how they were dealing with it. They were kind of going through something similar, not exact, but they dealt with it. They had leadership, and the feds took on that leadership. Here, the feds are ignoring it. They're not talking about it. And we're going to hear more about the Forks. And for those of you watching that don't understand the Forks, it's a little area in Winnipeg where two rivers meet. It's got some restaurants there and other businesses and a hotel. What happens if now, because if you're a lawyer, you're going to walk in with this precedent from the BC Supreme Court and you're going to slap it on the table in front of a judge and say, this Supreme Court said it was their land. You must do the same.
Okay, and so, but in the end, rather than transferring ownership of the Forks to a specific group, it'll be the how much question. How much would it take? Okay, we're going to buy the forks back from you.
But is that fair?
Fair? The fair only comes to town once a year.
Yeah, I'm not so sure I would be as worried about the forks or about similar places. There's a difference between these sorts of issues where there's a treaty versus where there's not. In British Columbia, the origins of this particular case, I think it was the Cowichan First Nation. I can't remember, but the origins of this are actually in real theft. There was a fishing village that was the First Nations people were basically swindled out of this by a corrupt colonial official who sold himself the land. And so I don't think there's any doubt that there's a claim here. Something has to be done. Something has to be done to address this. But yeah, there will be uncertainty for the next few years as we see how this shakes out. I mean, with the forks, you can always go to court. You can always make an argument. And First Nations might make that argument that we have some ownership stake in the forks. I'm just not as confident that that would be successful in the way that some of these British Columbia cases are successful.
But law is based on precedent for the most part, right? And you talked about that earlier when you were talking about immigrants that are getting lower sentences so that it doesn't impact their immigration. That's because the Supreme Court did that, so other lower court judges are following that lead. Precedent matters, and whenever you're in a court hearing, whether it's a lawsuit or a criminal charge or whatever, lawyers depend on precedent. They go back to precedent as much as they can. Now they have a Supreme Court decision that sets precedent. If nothing else, it could cost us millions upon billions in court costs if we start getting into lawsuits all across the country for certain parts of the land.
Yeah, I'm just not really convinced that it would be successful. I mean, it would establish a precedent. We have to wait to see what the Supreme Court says. And like I say, that's way off in the future, like 15 years into the future. I'm just not as convinced that those would be successful in any meaningful way. But as I say, you can always go to court. You can always try these things. And once you have a ruling in hand, that'll help for sure.
But I still believe that we shouldn't be counting on the courts, as we did when we had this discussion about the criminal charges for immigrants being reduced so that it didn't impact their immigration. That's the only reason they're doing it. That's wrong. That's ludicrous. The federal government needs to step in there. They make the laws, as Geoff Currier said. It's the federal government that makes the law, not the judges. So they're supposed to follow the law. They uphold the law, the letter of the law. They don't change it. And here, I think this is the same thing. The federal government needs to step up and they need to get engaged and say, okay, enough is enough. We need to have certainty in our country. Like, I mean, our inflation's going up. People are losing their jobs now in Canada. We're getting hit with tariffs from China and the U.S. and even Canada. Apparently, according to the an ambassador to Canada from the United States, Canada has put on the table the Canadian-Mexican deal, saying that if we're going to talk tariffs, we want to take this deal. We want this to be part of the deal now. So now our negotiators are bringing up what was not touched at the table. Maybe that's why we're waiting. So again, all of it, in my opinion, goes back to a federal government that is so afraid to do anything that they do nothing.
Well, I think, and it has been a concern. It's kind of a recurring theme in this panel with us that we need Prime Minister Carney and his government to step up and take some action and to start producing some results. We need to see some results that we're headed in the right direction, because to this point, we haven't seen that. Now, again, I don't expect the Prime Minister to negotiate in public. He's not like the President of the United States, who does negotiate in public, and I respect that. Having said that, you still need to show some kind of results, and we're just not seeing it.
Yeah, we need tougher, more decisive politicians in this country, right across the board. Justin Trudeau was quite decisive. He was just decisive on the worst possible issues. He was infringed on provincial jurisdiction, all these terrible decisions. But in general, politicians are shy away from difficult issues. They try to paper over differences. They don't want to deal with these difficult issues. And I actually think a lot of the problem in British Columbia right now can be traced to that. That these are problems that have become more and more difficult to deal with as time has gone by. And now we're kind of paying the piper for that. We need tougher, more decisive, more courageous politicians. And we should actually reward politicians for being courageous and for doing tough things.
Yeah. Being a politician that tried to do stuff like that and spoke out a lot, it's not that easy. You get attacked from every angle. So I understand why some of them put their head in the sand, but you don't get into it if that's your fear. You're going to get attacked. Whenever you want to do anything, change or challenge anything, you get attacked. I mean, that's the way of the left. That's how they deal with things. They attack you. If you don't like their way, they attack you. Same with the far right. Far right does that too. If you don't think like they do, they attack you. I mean, enough of the attacks. Let's get to work and fix this country. Anyways, interesting discussion today, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Next week, maybe we'll have some news on Donald Trump flying to Alaska to meet with Putin, and who knows? Maybe more will be happening here in Canada. Hopefully, the government does take some action to deal with the China tariffs and with the U.S. tariffs, but we're not hearing much right now. I appreciate your time. Look forward to reading your columns in the Winnipeg Sun.
Thanks for watching Inside Politics with Kevin Klein. Please like and subscribe to this channel and visit thewinnipegsun.com for more.